Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. UFOs have always fascinated me, but so has history and folklore. So in 2003, I decided to bring these passions together and create what would become the largest archive of historical UFO cases in the world. And it worked very well. It's called Magana Exchange, and this is its 16th year. We have 190 members across the world. Another one of them here among you tonight is, or this afternoon, sorry, Thomas Brisson. Where is Thomas? Where are you? Okay, he's here somewhere, and he's a member. He's our only member in Denmark at the moment, I believe, but we're looking for other people who are happy to collaborate on trying to make this even bigger and more interesting. I'll tell you something about it. Here you can see over there on the left is the number of posts that have been, there's Thomas over there with a drink. The number of posts that have been sent to the group to date. Each of those little numbers represent a month and a year. So we can see that some months have 600 different items being sent to the list, some have 500, some have 100. What that means is that people are using digitalized archives, libraries, because of today, of course, all of the libraries of the world have been digitalized or are undergoing a digitalization process for the first time, which enables us to do research today that couldn't have been done 20 years ago. People would have loved to have had access to as much information as we do today. So you can see here on the left a typical day of posts sent to the Magana Exchange group, and we receive dozens per day. Then this model, this sort of organization model, research model, has been sold, not for money, but the idea has been adopted by other people to collect Fortean data. There's an Italian group too, I like to call it our sister group, and they're doing exactly the same thing. Altogether, in Magana Exchange, we have about 40,000 cuttings, items, material, lost diaries, drawings from 1 century, 2 centuries, 4 centuries ago that people haven't seen before. This has all been lost in the world's libraries. Now, here, this morning I had time to look into the database and see what I had for Denmark. I think there was about 40, 50 items that came up on my laptop for Denmark. Some of these were contributed by our Danish member, Thomas Brisson, who's here today, as I said. And there are things out there. All libraries seem to have big newspaper collections, and you can find UFO cases in them. But not only UFOs. You could be interested in ghosts. You could be interested in goblins and goats and ghouls. Whatever passion you have, you can find it, and you can find material that people haven't seen for such a long time. And in the last 16 years, since I began this group, people have begun to write novels using this, short stories, documentaries, TV programs. It's been an exciting period. And in the group too, there are some university professors and the top-level ufologists like Jacques Vallée, Jerome Clark, and others, too numerous to name. Here you can see, that's me over there, sitting next to Jacques Vallée in a conference that we did in Madrid in the year 2015. And we sat and discussed our findings to an audience. I think it was probably 3 times the size of this. I mean, Madrid's as a capital city. There are a lot of people interested in these subjects. And you can see these are books that I've published. The one, there's one there at the bottom on the left, which is Wonders in the Sky with a white cover. That's what I published with Jacques Vallée in the year 2009. Then we did a re-edition of that it's totally revised and corrected. Unfortunately, we haven't found a cheaper way to distribute it yet. We will do, but if you want to, you can buy the big book that's on top of that, full color. But it's probably one of the most expensive UFO books available, simply because it's full color. We don't make any money out of it. We've lost money on this. Then next to that, there's a book called Return to Magana, which was also made by myself and a friend called Martin Schoff, who's a scientist living in Scotland, has an amazing technical mind, and we look at 22 UFO cases that are from history but contain enough information to analyze them using digital planetariums, maps. We use everything available to us. In fact, a lot of people say that it's very difficult to research a historical case if it happened 150 years ago. In fact, it can be easier to do it the older it is, because you can find more documents related to genealogy. You know where the witnesses lived. You can get a map of their house, of their village, of the street. You know who the neighbors were, because they all died over 100 years ago. No one's stopping you from investigating that, and all of that information is online. You can do very in-depth research into historical cases. And the other books there were 3 in Spanish, which I've published in the last few years too. So I've been quite active. But about 10 years ago, I realized that I'd seen enough UFO cases, and what I really wanted to do was to see how I could fit them together, and find out what they meant. I was more interested in, instead of collecting more and more and getting the largest archive in the world, I was much more interested in finding out exactly how they fit together. What has the evolution been over time of UFOs and our belief in extraterrestrials? And of course, I was interested in knowing how much of it is true, how much of it is mythology and folklore. I want to know what is an urban legend and what is real. When you study an urban legend, which is something that I also do outside the UFO field, for example, if a friend tells you that there are mutant alligators living in the sewers of New York, you don't just jump down the nearest drain with a shotgun. What you do is you try to find the earliest possible version of that story. You try to go to the source, and it's by going to the source that you can solve a lot of these mysteries. Anyway. One of the questions that I wanted to ask 10 years ago, when I stopped researching, stopped getting new cases, I wanted to concentrate on the big questions. Why were UFOs shaped like saucers? Because, I don't know if you know this, but before 1947, there practically weren't any saucer-shaped UFOs. They could be any shape at all, including saucers. But, we have thousands and thousands of cases. We can do studies that have never been done before. I can tell you that less than 2% were disc-shaped. So why is it that on the 24th of June, 1947, when Kenneth Arnold saw 9 objects in the sky above Mount Rainier, why did the world believe in or see saucer shapes from that moment onwards? For example, if I draw something like that, you will instinctively and automatically know that that's a spaceship, that that's a UFO. But the crazy thing is, UFOs don't look like that. They've never looked like that, not really. That's just how we imagine them to be, but there's no reason for it. I think that even on YouTube, you're not going to find UFOs that look like that. So what happened? Why did we suddenly start thinking that they had this shape? Well, the weird thing is that Kenneth Arnold himself never said that they looked like that at all. And it's odd because he went up into the sky in his aeroplane, he came down and he did interviews with journalists, and they asked him, what did those objects look like? And he said, well, they were bat-shaped, like bats, like Batman, bats. Yeah, like if you imagine Batman builds an airplane, he'll probably build something like this. And you could say, that's weird, because, I mean, he's the guy who started the flying saucer craze, because it was a craze for a long period of time in 1947. But he never said he saw saucers. And I have some quotes from him there. The first one, they were half-moon shaped. That's something he said on June the 27th. He said they were somewhat bat-shaped. That was the day before. That in 1950, in a radio interview, he said, this is Kenneth Arnold speaking, when I described how they flew, I said they flew like they take a saucer and throw it across the water. Most of the newspapers misunderstood and misquoted that too. They said that I said that they were saucer-like. I said that they flew in a saucer-like fashion. He didn't want to make flying saucers popular, but suddenly the next day, the next week, the next month, everybody was seeing saucer shapes in the sky. And it's quite interesting, because if you go back, I don't have them here, but if you go back to that month, what people were reporting, generally speaking, were not giant saucers big enough to be piloted by humanoids. They were often tiny things. Because at this point, nobody actually related them to UFOs, to extraterrestrials at all. They were just saucers. So they thought they must look like saucers. They must be the size of saucers. And that's what you get. 15, 20, 25 sightings a week of tiny saucers. People throwing them in the street out of their balconies, out of their windows, and saying, flying saucer. And then there were rewards given to anybody who could capture a real flying saucer. All of this has been totally forgotten by ufologists. If you ask modern ufology, I only study pre-Arnold ufology, or 1947, 1948. But when you speak to ufologists who specialize in from the period of 47 to today, they're not really aware of this. They don't know how it started. This is how it started. Radio stations were offering $1,000 in 1947. That's quite a lot of money, really. $1,000 for anyone who could bring them a genuine flying saucer. Some people thought that they were made by the Russians. There were jokes about how inflation had made coins rise to the sky, or all kinds of strange ideas. And so people were actually getting anything that looked saucer-shaped or whatever and taking them to radio stations hoping to get rich. So when Kenneth Arnold made this pamphlet here, he used what he called what he really saw. He said that he really saw this shape. It was like a bat, like a crescent. He signed it. He would sell these for 50 cents. To anybody who spoke to him and wanted his autograph. He also sold lapel pins with exactly this shape, and he told people, this is what I saw. This is exactly what I saw. So you could say that in 1947, the only person who never saw flying saucers was Kenneth Arnold himself. In fact, he had a second sighting, and you know what they looked like? He said, ducks. He said they looked like ducks. I mean, it's a curious thing. So, of course, I was very interested in why people talked about flying saucers so much. Then I did some research of my own. And, oh, by the way, this is his visiting card. This is his business card. He would show this to people, leave this in hotels. There's a text on the other side from the OHASP sect, I think it is. But anyway, that's what he would give to people. What I discovered was that flying saucers had a much longer history than we imagine. The word flying saucer itself wasn't invented in 1947. If you look it up in Wikipedia up to last year, it would say the word flying saucer, the phrase was invented in 1947. You look it up in the Oxford Dictionary, it would say exactly the same thing. So using all these resources that have become available, I discovered that the expression flying saucer was about 70 years older than that. It's a phrase that was used in newspapers continuously because it refers to the little clay disc that was thrown by sportsmen during a very important sport in the United States at the time, trap shooting. And they called them flying saucers. So it's amazing. Sometimes you find newspapers, it says, people have been shooting down the flying saucers have fallen onto a house, a flying saucer has crashed through a window, and it looks amazing until you realize that they've never heard of flying saucers as extraterrestrial craft. These people were talking about little discs. You can see here that's the patent of the man who invented at that time he called it a flying target. Very quickly they called it flying saucers. It just looks like one, to be honest. And that's the book which I published with Martin Schoff a few years ago that nobody's read. And you're going to find all that information in there. So I spent a year or two with a website just talking about this subject, the origin of the expression flying saucers. Nobody was interested. I wrote to people editing books and Wikipedia and everything else. And then finally last year, Wikipedia changed its entry. And now if you look it up, it says that the expression flying saucer came from the 1890s. It doesn't mention me, but I call it progress anyway. Okay, next thing. I was interested too in asking another big question. How long have people believed extraterrestrials are coming to Earth from other planets? And it's a question that hasn't really been asked before. And I was surprised, this was only 10 years ago, I was surprised that nobody had really asked this question. What normally happens is they'll say, oh, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and so on, but they didn't say that people came from other planets. They were talking about their own gods and myths and so on. So how long have people really believed that extraterrestrials come to Earth? Well, a friend of mine, Jacques Vallée, wrote this book, Passport to Magana. It was published in 1969. Very interesting book. It's a classic, an instant classic in ufology. This guy who's a friend of Steven Spielberg, he helped influence the whole field for the first few decades. He worked with the government, with Alan Hynek. And he wrote this book in which he says that ghosts and goblins and elves, the angels and demons and witches of our ancestors could be the UFO pilots that we see today. Maybe what our ancestors saw, what our great-grandparents saw, and interpreted as angels and demons and elves were actually little grey men. In this sense. So it was a very influential book, but it still didn't really answer my question. I still wanted to know when people began to say that people from other planets came to Earth. I couldn't imagine, for example, Queen Victoria having a conversation about extraterrestrial sightings. I found that difficult to believe. The idea that Charles Dickens could have a talk down the pub about crashed alien spaceships, I found that very hard to imagine. Or, for example, Abraham Lincoln, I could imagine him reading ghost stories, but alien abductions, it's something that it's very difficult to imagine. It seems totally inappropriate, in fact, for people from that period to have any knowledge at all or any inclination that these things existed. But then I was wrong. I was wrong about that. I discovered in newspapers and books from the 19th century and going backwards to the 18th century, that they really did. These people really did read about extraterrestrials, extraterrestrial landings, close encounters, not ghosts that they thought looked a little bit like aliens, or we think they thought that, but they read in the newspaper about crash landings of objects covered in hieroglyphics and things like that from other planets, and they speculated about the civilizations that launched this into space. And it seems incredible, but it's true. And this is something that collectively we have forgotten. And that's not healthy. We should remember that the things that interest us today, that we see on TV, in these conferences, in magazines and books, people have been talking about this for at least 200 years. In a sense, what's happening is we're recycling everything. It's just us recycling the mysteries of our great-great-grandparents. I don't know what Queen Victoria spoke to her friends about over a pint of beer, but I can assure you that a lot of people in London really were talking about aliens. Now, what I want to do is to give an illustration of what I'm talking about, comparing two stories, one from the 1860s and one from the 1960s. Well, according to a newspaper published in 1963, a huge meteorite exploded over Jamaica, sending fragments cascading through the air. And one of these whirled and landed next to a river, the river Cobre, which is that one, in fact. And it crashed through the trees, and the only people out that evening was, there was a stagecoach, horses, and 3 passengers, 3 men. They heard it, they saw it, they got out of the stagecoach, according to the newspaper at least, and they approached this mass of rock, which they could see in the dim moonlight. And one of them was a guy called Dr. Hopkins, an English scientist. He inspected it, and he saw that it was a meteorite. And he was quite excited about that, because it's very difficult to find meteorites in the West Indies. It's not a place to find meteorites normally. So the very next day, he and his friends hauled this object back to his laboratory and started to analyze it. And the first thing he realized was it had a very strange shape. It was sort of convex. The upper surface was convex. The lower surface was concave. And using alcohol, rubbing alcohol, he removed some resin, and under the resin he found hieroglyphs. He found hieroglyphics, a picture of the sun, pictures of buildings, and he said, "This is very strange. How is it possible that this object has possibly fallen from the sky?" Which should shock him in the same way that should shock us. I mean, 1863, we're talking about American Civil War, that kind of period. Isn't it weird to think that they didn't have access to Star Trek and Star Wars and whatever, the Discovery Channel, and there they were talking about this kind of thing. Now, this story is very interesting, and it appeared in many scientific journals at the time. I found it in scientific journals in Polish, and in French, in Spanish, many other places, in German. In fact, I found it originally in a South African newspaper. That took me to a German book, which is almost impossible to read using that very old writing. And then that took me to the source. But we've forgotten that all of that existed. I want to compare that to another case from 1965. Okay, the last one was 1863. This is 1965. The stories are different, but I'd like to make a few comparisons. Now, it was December the 9th, 1965, and this meteor exploded over Kecksburg, in Pennsylvania, or at least some people thought it was a meteor. And a fragment of this was witnessed coming down through the trees, broke the trees, landed somewhere. So the witnesses contacted the police. They began to talk about what exactly had happened. They thought maybe an airplane had crash landed. They were out until 2 a.m. trying to find what they imagined would be survivors of this plane crash. They couldn't find them or it or anything. There was nothing to find. It was a bit like the object had totally disintegrated. Now, the story could have ended there, as many of these stories do. But then other witnesses came forward. And I'm not saying at this point whether their stories are true, they're not true. I'm just comparing one story to another from 100 years later. The witnesses said that they'd seen a large yellow, gold-colored object with the shape of a giant acorn that was covered in hieroglyphics. And it was just sitting there. There wasn't a door, there wasn't a window. They didn't know what it was. Then the military arrived. They put the whole thing into a truck, drove off, and that's the reason that it completely disappeared. Now, it's interesting to think that in 1863, people were dealing with an object that had fallen from space, that was covered in writing, in alien writing, and it was inspected by scientists and so on. And then in 1965, the same stories appear about another object that had fallen down. This particular one was the most publicized UFO crash since Roswell. And I found a lot of stories like this throughout this period. In fact, it's a continuum of stories, constantly. There isn't a 5-year period in which we don't find a tale of this kind. That does not invalidate UFOs. It doesn't bolster the case for them either. But what it means is that we've got to remember that we're just talking about exactly the same things throughout history. It has not it's all been forgotten. Your great-great-grandparents could possibly have heard about these things. The thing is, to know whether in a particular country UFOs were reported or not in the 19th century, and whether these things were popular, you need to have access to digitalized archives. There's no way otherwise. Otherwise you'll ruin your eyes and spend hours and hours a day looking at random volumes of newspapers. Here in Denmark at the moment, I think it's a little bit more difficult to do this kind of investigation, but it will happen, and we'll see what our ancestors once believed. So there we have the original thing. It says 1862 because apparently it fell the previous year, and this is the object that they saw in 1965. What does it all mean? Well, it's rather difficult to say. Now, by the end of this talk, because I had to choose a topic, and by the end of this talk, you're going to know 3 things. You're going to understand 3 things a lot better. The first thing is that our ancestors were chasing the same stories as ufologists do today. Okay, that's a fact. I can prove that. That's a fact. Whatever you find today, our ancestors were looking for exactly the same things, whether it was alien abductions, remote viewing other planets, or crashed UFOs. There's nothing that people are looking for today that our ancestors were not. You're going to understand in a moment how this inscribed Jamaican meteorite from 1863 fits into the story. At the moment, it just seems like an anomaly, but you'll understand the reason in a moment. And I'd like to tell you where the ancient aliens theory comes from, because everyone's heard of that now, because it's such a big, important TV program. And it used to be called Ancient Astronauts, now they call it Ancient Aliens. But have you heard of the ancient aliens theory? I suppose most of you have. Yeah? Okay, right. So where does it come from? Who started it? Normally, when you ask people, they'll say, I don't know, 1960s, 1950s, 1970s, Eric von Daniken, something like that. But in fact, it's a little bit older than that, as we'll see. Okay, now, we're going to start with this question, however. How long have people believed in life on other planets? Okay, so this is not visitation, simply the idea that other planets are full of intelligent beings. Well, the thing is with thousands of years that there aren't texts that go back that far. So you could say, well, thousands of years ago, there were stories of gods, there were stories of spirits, there are carvings and paintings, but none of this tells us that people were aware that there were planets like ours inhabited by other people. So that's the thing. Most people will go, oh, well, recently, let's say, the beginning of the century or the start of science fiction. And then if I say, no, further back, they'll immediately say, oh, the Babylonians, and take it to the other extreme. But there are no texts. There's nothing in cuneiform about other planets described as other planets with intelligent life on them. So there must be a point in history when people said, this is a planet, that's a planet, people come from that planet. Well, there are many interesting books that you can buy on this subject because it's become an academic subject now. They teach this at university because the belief in what they call the plurality of worlds has become a legitimate study. You can do degrees in it. You can do all kinds of courses in this. It's an important part of people's degrees. There are doctoral theses published on this subject, and all the information's there if you want to get it. It's in English at least, and you can buy them on Amazon. Now, when did it all start? Well, it started really with the ancient Greeks, a theory called atomism. They believed that the universe and everything in it, including ourselves, was composed of atoms. It's an incredible belief because they didn't have microscopes. How did they reach the conclusion that we were built of atoms? But that's what they said. They believed that. And they had this theory that if the whole universe is built of the same atoms, the same kinds of atoms, they're going to form the same kinds of patterns wherever they go. That was the idea. So if they've created this planet, they're also going to create other planets and life on other planets and so on. So you can say that the theory of the inhabited universe started with the ancient Greeks. Epicurus said there are infinite worlds, both like and unlike ours. Now, the problem with this theory was that, as I said, you cannot see an atom. So it was a very philosophical and logical period in human history. People said, okay, so everything's made of atoms, show me an atom. And they said, well, I can't show you an atom. And they said, no, show me a photo of an atom. And they said, come on, there are no photos. There are no photos. It's thousands of years ago. So it wasn't possible. So this theory decayed very quickly, and it was replaced by something totally different. It was replaced by Aristotle's theory of the cosmos. Now, when this theory became dominant, what happened was that it totally eliminated the possibility of alien planets, because it was basically the Earth in the center, then there was a series of concentric skies, the little stars on the outer rim, and there were planets, but they were basically just like energy balls. It was impossible for anyone to live there. So, according to Aristotle's theory, there were no aliens because there were no planets. There was nothing outside the sky, and the sky wasn't very far away. And that was it, the end. But that theory was forgotten for a while. In China and Japan, they didn't have this problem because they already started talking about extraterrestrial life. You go back 1,000 years, and you'll find that philosophers, there's one called Deng Mu, for example. I was studying Chinese for a few years. He said in the year 1000 BC, it would be unreasonable to believe there are no other planets like our own. So the Chinese and the Japanese, Koreans didn't have a problem with this. But it was medieval Christians who said, no, the Bible doesn't mention other planets. There are no galactic gardens of Eden. So, therefore, the only thing that exists in creation is our planet, exactly what Aristotle said. So in the 12th century in Europe, this became, the Aristotle theory had a massive comeback, and everybody said, this is it. We are alone in the universe, there are no more aliens. That happened to be the case until the year 1277. In 1277, something massive happened, something like a revolution. And what happened was very simple. This man, Etienne Tempier, who was the bishop of Paris, and his philosophers said, no, wait a minute, we can't say that, that there are no other planets. We can't say that the universe ends there. What are you doing? Are you limiting God's power? Are you saying that God cannot make another planet? And anyway, why did they make so much space if we can never go there? We only have little balloons and things. How are we ever going to get outside our atmosphere? He said that, they used very interesting logical arguments. He said, if God he said to his friends, basically, if God wanted to move the universe 5 meters towards the left or the right, could God do it in his omnipotence? And they, of course, said, well, yes, because he's God. Ah, well, of course, if you want to move your cupboard, your chair, your bed, your fridge 5 meters to the right, that means there must be space there for it to move into. And his friends were like, oh, right, wow, you're so logical and so bright. And so that way, he proved, just by logic, that there must be space outside the visible universe. And people said, yeah, okay, so there is. So let's abandon Aristotle's view then. Let's say that if you just follow Aristotle, you're saying blindly that there is nothing else, but logically there must be. So that was a massive step in the evolution of the extraterrestrial theory, 1277. Now, after that point, people started speculating about the possibility of other worlds, which was nice. And suddenly, all of the great intellectuals of the Enlightenment and so on, Charles Darwin's grandfather, everyone that you can imagine, started writing poems about aliens. There were aliens in literature. There were aliens absolutely everywhere. There were debates. If it were today, there'd be debates on TV all the time about this kind of thing. It was a massive difference. People were able to say, we're not alone in the universe. So you have everybody from Galileo to Voltaire talking about alien life. So in a sense, if it weren't for these people today, we wouldn't have UFOs perhaps, because we're talking about a vital part in the link between us and the Greeks. If aliens had never become a thing, we wouldn't have a name for it, I expect. Anyway, so this was exciting, and people began having some very interesting new ideas that, again, we've totally forgotten about, and some of them seem a bit crazy to us, but there we are. Here, for example, here we're talking about Robert Harrington. He wrote a book in which he suggested that the sun also contained intelligent life. He was saying that that our sun was inhabited by civilizations, that there are people on the sun. Maybe they'd come and see us one day. You know, that was the idea. The discoverer of Uranus, William Herschel, also believed that there were extraterrestrials living on the sun. And there he is looking at them. That's not a recommendable thing to do. Don't do it today particularly. But he went out, got the biggest telescope he could find, and started looking at the sun. Very bad idea. Then this guy here, you probably never heard of him, I don't know, but in Britain, W. Raymond Drake was the man who popularized the gods and spacemen theory before von Däniken. And I called him one day, and I was 16 years old. W. Raymond Drake. I called him. He was in the bath. I spoke to his wife for a while. Then Marjorie said, "Come on, Raymond." And then he got out of the bath. He spoke to me, and he told me that he also believed that there was life living on the sun. He was totally sure that there was life living on the sun, apart from other planets. So I wouldn't say that this belief survived 300 years, but it's amazing how people can reach this kind of conclusion. So if you ever see anything written by this man, he was a real Renaissance man in the UFO world. Okay. I want to talk for a moment about how towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 20th century, people started saying that there were aliens in religion. Religious leaders started saying, well, we know all about the aliens. We talk to them. They come to us, in fact. We don't have to go there. Sometimes they said they went there in a trance state. Whether they did or not, I'm not even going to say what I think. It doesn't matter what I think. Maybe they did. Maybe they remote viewed other planets. I suppose that these are abilities that if they exist, and they really could, they could do that. I don't know. I can't speculate about what was happening. But Emanuel Swedenborg said he spoke to people from Jupiter and Mercury and Venus and Saturn and so on. And the interesting thing is, he still has a big following. There's a church, there's a Swedenborg church. I think there are 3 of them, and they have thousands of followers, and they make videos for YouTube explaining to people that, yeah, he really did go to Saturn, he really did go to Jupiter. So you can look that up. And so that has survived all these years. Then it was the turn of the Mormons. I don't know how many Mormons there are in Copenhagen. You know, they have a lot of interesting beliefs, but one of them was that was deeply associated with extraterrestrials. You don't find extraterrestrials in the Book of Mormon, but if you look in the Book of Abraham and all of the other Mormon gospel writings, the church writings, they talk about UFOs and aliens constantly. There's one theory, for example, which I didn't know that it still existed until recently. I was in a conversation with a Mormon. One of them is, how do they explain fossils in the ground? Because they don't like evolution. So how do they explain dinosaur fossils? And they said, well, no, what happens is that God, he's an ecologist in a sense. He recycles planets. And there was a planet inhabited by dragons and dinosaurs and monsters. And what he did was to take that planet, recycle it, and give it to us. So very occasionally we'll find a bit of an old monster or a dragon or a dinosaur in the ground. That explains fossils. Okay, I'm not going to say whether that's true or not. I'm just saying that Joseph Smith brought aliens to the people through Mormonism. It's a very interesting period of time. And we're talking about 1823, 1840. Then we have Ellen G. Harmon, who helped found the Seventh Adventist, the Church of the Seventh Adventists. And she also said there in the 19th century that she was talking to people in Saturn and Jupiter, and she traveled around the universe and so on. Sometimes in a trance-like state, sometimes they visited her, apparently. One of the theories was that Jesus Christ was coming down from a planet. If you look at Joseph Smith, he believed that God had a throne next to a planet called Kolob in the universe, and there he was. And she had a very similar idea, and she said that Jesus Christ is somewhere in the galaxy, and if we pray hard enough, he'll come to us. And they expected a particular day. It was one day when he was going to come to Earth as long as we prayed enough. And it was in October, and they prayed, and the people sold their houses and sold their children or whatever, and they waited for this day on top of a hill. You can imagine them all completely naked. They didn't need anything anymore, and of course it never happened. And they call that the day of the great disappointment. And so they went back to the drawing board. If they still had one, they probably sold it. And they calculated the next date and the next date and the next date. They were constantly moving the date of when the great revelation or second coming was going to happen, but he was going to come through space. We can also mention the Spiritualists, and this is an interesting thing, and I'm looking into this at the moment. The Spiritualist movement, and it was another religious movement, it really fascinated people in Europe, throughout Europe. I'm sure that if I look at the history books of the esoteric landscape of Denmark, Norway, and so on of the period. I'll find spiritualism here too. And that's when they started saying that through seances they could contact Martians and Venusians. The first person ever to say that he'd contacted somebody from Jupiter was the author Victor Hugo in September 1853. He said that he'd spoken to people from Jupiter through a seance, and that's exactly what they did. So whatever people do today to try to contact aliens from their sitting room, that's what they did in 1853. Now, I'm interested too in another area of this, because although none of these people described spaceships in the way we would today, they were mainly talking about speaking to Venusians, but not exactly explaining how they got here, or speaking about themselves traveling to other planets and not saying how they traveled. It doesn't mean that spaceships hadn't started to become a thing for people. People had it within their imaginative grasp. They were able to imagine spaceships perfectly well. And if you're interested in ufology, it's a good idea to have some grounding in the science fiction that preceded it. It doesn't invalidate UFOs. I want to say right now, I've seen a UFO on the 6th of April, 1996, in Talarrubias, a village in Badajoz in Spain, and I'm totally sure what I saw. I am a witness. But it doesn't mean that I shouldn't know about this kind of thing. I want to know where it comes from. I want to know where all the rest of it comes from. So I can be skeptical about the mythology and the urban legends and a lot of different things, but it doesn't mean that I totally discard UFOs. Returning to Japan, there was a fascinating tale called The Tale of Princess Kaguya. I don't know if you ever heard of her. They made a beautiful animation of this recently. And it's about a farmer who, this is from the year 1000 AD. 1000 AD. I don't know what they were doing in this country in 1000 AD. In England, where I'm from, very little, I expect. They weren't inventing stories like this. A farmer is walking in his field and he suddenly sees a glowing cob, corn, a stalk, and he looks in it and he sees a tiny baby and it's a little girl. And he takes the baby and takes her home and gives her this name, Kaguya. And over time, she turns out to be the most beautiful woman that he's ever seen, that anyone's ever seen, in fact. So she becomes like a princess among farming communities. And the king and the princes, everybody wants to marry her. I think the king was already married. I don't remember that part of the story very well, but in any case, everyone wanted to marry her. But then suddenly, one day she confessed, actually, my parents, you're not going to meet them because they're from the moon, and they're going to come, and they're going to kill you, and they're going to take me back. And the king said, I don't think that's going to happen. We have these amazing soldiers. We have advanced technology, spears and arrows and swords and whatever they had. And she said, that's not really going to help. And then in this story, beautiful story, you can find it, suddenly all these people come from the moon with their advanced weaponry, their spaceships, literally spaceships. And they just destroy all the emperor's weapons, his army. They take Kaguya again, and they take her up to the moon. And that's the end of the story. But the point is, I mean, what's that? Is that an abduction? Is that a close encounter? Science fiction? It's something that, it doesn't matter what it is, you have to think, wow, our ancestors thought of that. Our ancestors had that. And the only reason they'd invent a story like that is if people are going to read it, not laugh at it. People were really aware of the importance of this kind of thing. Okay, speeding through, we get to Micromegas in 1752, in which Voltaire speaks about giant aliens, for example, from Sirius, come down to the planet, talk to our philosophers. Then we have a very nice picture of a spaceship in this book, Les Philosophies sans prétention. I can't speak French, written by a man called Le Follier. And amazing, 1775, this guy comes from Mercury, an alien from Mercury, comes to Earth, crashes into one of our mountains, destroys his ship. And then he says, well, to get back to Mercury, I need a piece of metal. I need a special metal to power the engines. Spends his life looking for this piece of metal. And then the book is about that. I've read the book. It's very interesting. You can find modern copies available. We can talk about 1809, Washington Irving's History of New York. Knickerbocker's History of New York, he called it. Here we find the first mention of aliens with green skin. I did a big study on this. You can find me on Wikipedia. When did we start saying that aliens had green skin? Well, in 1809. He said that. And he said that the men in the moon were going to come down to Earth. They didn't like us. They were going to transform us into moon men, just like themselves. That was their idea as missionaries. They wanted to transform humanity, make them more like them. Although personally, I think we have enough lunatics already. Saw the newspaper yesterday with our new Prime Minister. Anyway. I don't know if you know this woman here, Jane Taylor. You've probably never heard of her name. But it's great to get a woman in this too. I'm sure many of the influences here have been women, but you know what history is like. Now, she wrote a little song that everybody knows, at least in my country. If I go to Spain, they know it there too. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. You know, I'm sure that you've heard of it. Kids love it. Yeah, I'm sure that when you were younger. And she wrote this, and we shouldn't forget her name for that reason. But it's interesting that she loved writing about extraterrestrials. She had a novel called Should It Strike a Stranger? Here, strike refers to surprise, about a man from Venus, which happens to be the star in the little song, actually, the Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And it talks about his visit to the planet Earth. 1824, apparently, that was first published. So whenever you hear Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, think about this woman. Think about what it actually means. She thought the twinkling star was full of people, full of alien civilizations. Fascinating idea. Okay. In 1809, we find the first satire. It was almost a hoax because it was published as if it were news. And it was about a man called Charles Butterworth who's looking through a window and he sees the moon suddenly sort of jettison out all of these purple orbs. He says, what's going on here? And one of them comes through his window in London and it transforms into a little man. And he tries to interact with the little man, and all these weird things happen. But what I discovered was, because of different references in the story, it was just referring to a parliamentary case of, it was a scandal. It was a sex for favours scandal in the year 1809, and it was all about the Duke of York. So the first time that aliens were presented as news, as alien contact in this way, it was just a satire referring to this man. Okay, so we've seen the basic ideas then. We've seen we sort of set the scene in a way. We know that for centuries and centuries, people talked about UFOs. They were dreaming about UFOs. They were painting about UFOs. There were aliens here and aliens there. Storytellers wrote tales of lost UFOs ending up on Earth, and mystics tried to contact them, and people looked for them and went to hills and tried to find them. Very little has changed. That's basically the same as today, and we're talking about 150 years ago. I could talk about abductions. There's a whole, but I didn't prepare anything about abductions, but what I did talk about was something even more relevant. Meteorites. Now, sometimes ufologists like to say, well, you know, scientists didn't believe in meteorites until they could prove they existed. I want to tell you something about meteorites. Nobody believed in meteorites. They said, that's not possible. Stones don't fly. Stones can't float in the air. Whatever people say they saw fall from the sky can't be true. And no one thought that shooting stars had anything to do with meteorites. They said, oh, that's just... You see, Aristotle had a theory about this, and although most of Aristotle's ideas are abandoned, one of his ideas was, I don't know how to express it. Well, basically, every time the planet farts, these gases come out, and they turn into fireworks in the atmosphere. And that was Aristotle's idea. He called them exhalations. Exhalations, okay? The point is that nobody believed in the meteorites until 1794. And this guy, Ernst Chladni, a German physicist, he had this crazy idea. He said, meteorites actually come from outer space. They are out, and shooting stars are meteorites that we see coming through the atmosphere. And people said, no way. And he said, yes, way. That is exactly what they are. And they laughed at him, as they would. But he was so lucky, because 2 months after he published this book saying that meteorites came from outer space, there was a massive shower of meteorites in Siena, in Italy. Everybody saw them. They couldn't say no anymore. Then, a year and a half later, this meteorite landed in the garden of a military man in England, in Wold Cottage. And there was no way that they could say that that wasn't true. This guy was really important. And then another one landed in Normandy. There's a piece of that in there. His ideas were proven. He was extremely happy. He didn't worry about what Wikipedia said. He knew that he was right. Okay? So something happened at that time. Now, that was very important to the story of UFOs, alien crashes, and so on. I'll tell you why. This started the alien astronaut theory, the ancient astronaut theory. Because people said, well, if pieces of other planets land on Earth, it must be because a volcano has shot those rocks into the air, or because two planets have collided. And if two planets collide, fragments of those planets must be scattered everywhere, and then they will fall here. Imagine Earth colliding into another planet, and this place ending up on Mars or something. So people said, well, maybe that explains everything. Maybe that actually explains everything. In this year, 1823, a French writer invented the ancient astronaut theory. Okay? Yeah, it had a massive impact. We've forgotten about it today. But he said that in ancient times, two planets collided. When they collided, all the people, all the animals, the flora, the fauna, the monuments, other things, artificial objects, were scattered across the solar system. Many of them landed on this planet. This caused Noah's flood. This caused the sinking of Atlantis. This caused everything. Any monument that you might see must have come from that collision of planets. This was like Eric von Daniken, about 100 years before Eric von Daniken was born. And when he said this, he was extremely influential. People listened to this, and he said, yes, that explains everything. That explains the origin of everything. And another thing he said was that those supermen, that's the basic translation of them, that's why I've added this picture, became our ancestors. He said that those beings came from that planet, and when they crash-landed onto the Earth, they survived, or some of them survived, they had children, and we are their descendants. So this whole idea of ancient astronauts originated 1823. And this book led to another book, and that book led to another book, and so on and so on and so on. Throughout the 19th century, people were fascinated by the ancient aliens theory. I bet you didn't realize that. I didn't know this until I started this project. And one of the most ambitious theories that I found was from 1870, very, very influential. A guy called Auguste Dufresne in Paris, a very formal, serious presentation in front of the French Geographical Society, and he said, well, I have a theory that's going to be very, very important for everybody. Well, Australia is a very strange country. Australia with koala bears and kangaroos and whatever. You know, nobody can explain Australia. And he said, well, you know what happened? Australia was an asteroid that landed on our planet. The whole of Australia was one asteroid that crash-landed into the Pacific. And that's why none of the creatures who live there make any sense. He said that the kangaroos were obviously alien, the koala bears, everything that you can imagine.
That's true.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought that makes sense. And he said that as the world spun, this caused the continent to become flatter and flatter, and that's what we have today. And people said, oh, very good, all right, thank you very much. And he said, oh, but what this actually means is that the Aborigines in Australia, you know, they're the aliens. Their land entered our property, we can take it from them. So he was trying to use this theory as a way to take the land away from the Australian Aborigines by saying, sorry, it's landed in our garden. And that was the theory they had. So all of these ideas really did have a massive impact on how people thought. That's why I say our great-great-grandparents, very similar ideas to what we had today. Then another interesting thing happened too. If they said, well, all of these ideas of planetary collisions are very nice, and our ancestors came from another planet, you know, these are appearing in the newspapers that Charles Dickens was reading. Maybe simple meteorites bring with them other things. So there was a huge influx of stories. And I'm going to tell you some of them. In 1847, in a place called Fort Hill. Oh, by the way, I've investigated all of these. That thing I said about flying saucers and where does the expression flying saucer come from, it took me about 3 weeks to work that out, to connect flying saucers with shooting down clay discs, about 3 weeks. But this took me about 15 years. Not this particular case, but the ones I'm going to tell you now, and this is just a fraction of what I have. 15 years to collect it all together and realize that it's just one continuous line. There are no gaps between that and Roswell. There are no gaps. It's seriously one continuous line of stories. Anyway, 1847, what did they say? They said that this meteorite crashed into Arkansas, and when they went to look for it, they took it out of the hole. It was burning hot, and it wasn't a simple meteorite. It was a head. It was a little statuette. It wasn't a meteorite at all. This was in all the newspapers at the time. It was everywhere. And I'll just read a little bit of this to you. It says, the most astonishing thing of all is that the mass presents the exact resemblance of the bust of a human being. Such a circumstance is truly astonishing to everyone who's witnessed it. And had it descended a few centuries ago or fallen among any portion of the heathen world, it would no doubt have been regarded as the descent of a god. But many of our citizens regard it as a meteoric substance, and the only thing which seems to puzzle the most learned among them is its shape. That was in 1847. Then you have this one from 1863, which we looked at originally. Meteorite arrives. What is it? It's covered in hieroglyphics. They study it, and they reach the conclusion it's part of an arch. It belonged to a building on another planet. How did it get here? Who knows? Dr. Hopkins had five conclusions, which were the first conclusion, that the fireball came from a celestial body where plants grow because he found organic matter clinging to it, giving rise to the formation of coal. This celestial body is inhabited by intelligent beings who know civilization, architecture, the art of drawing, and advanced geometry. The people of this unknown world live in subterranean dwellings. He based that on the pictures that he could see under the resin. They seem to be a variety of vertebrates, and their bodies are symmetrical. And finally, it's likely their size does not exceed 1/4 of a man. So we're talking about little things. Who theoretically made this. As I said, I've got to the bottom of all these stories. If you want to know more, you'll have to buy my book. But unfortunately, it hasn't been published yet. So, 1864, this was published. Someone found a meteorite, 1864, on James's Peak, okay, in Colorado. They took it out of the ground. What do they find inside? They found a dead mummy. They found a dead mummy, a plaque with hieroglyphics on it. They found weird things, little instruments. They found cups and saucers, all kinds of things inside this giant meteorite. So there's that. I put a little quote here It says, in all probability, therefore, the aerolith, the same as meteorite, must have originated from the planet Mars, which is, moreover, our nearest neighbor. We may consider beyond doubt that the planets really are inhabited and that there are creatures there that are very similar to those on Earth. Okay, 1865, suddenly, in the Rockies, massive thing comes down. It's another meteorite. No, it's not. It has weird compartments in it. There are hieroglyphics in it. What's going on? A man found it, a man called James Lumley, who was a trapper. And we don't have to read all of this, but basically it's saying how they're worried about how extraterrestrials one day might come to Earth, maybe using these meteoric vehicles, and turn us all into slaves. That was something they were very worried about. 1865. In April 1883, this sword came from the sky. This was a really strange story. I'm dying to go to Rochester in New York to investigate this myself. I know the object existed. I can't tell you what it was yet, but a doctor saw a meteorite fall from the sky, landed in some water in a creek, and when they took it out another day, they realized it was a sword full of hieroglyphics. And they said it was too big for humans. Obviously, there'd been a war on some planet, and maybe it's from a dynamite or something. Something exploded and sent this through the sky. Who knows how it got to Earth, but there it is. I mean, a lot of these stories are funny and they're silly, but at the same time, they're being written for an audience who can believe them. They're not writing for people who are going to laugh at all these things. These start chain reactions. These stories start chain reactions which make other people think about them and write about them and dream about them. Aliens, more than 100 years ago. Everything totally forgotten about. Here in Russia, in March 1884, suddenly, I mean, there it was in the newspapers, people were woken up in St. Petersburg by loud explosions. What were they? Objects crashing to the ground. They thought that the nihilists were attacking, but then they discovered these were meteorites. They went there, they started breaking them open, those that hadn't broken open them themselves. What do they find inside? Mummies, dead people. What's going on? Those are the stories that were published at the time. People were reading this, believing this, and passing this information on to their children. Here we have quite a famous one, actually. In 1884, in Nebraska, something came down, exploded. What did people find? Pieces of machinery. Cogwheels and everything you could possibly imagine, burning hot. Couldn't go near it because then you would burn your skin. They believed that it had been an alien crash, just like Roswell, but we're talking about 1884. And there are so many of them. 1887, a sphere arrived. It had things written on the outside of it, a star, a dinosaur, an Archaeopteryx actually, was written, like drawn on the outside of it. Where did it come from? Who knows, etc. This was an interesting one. I thought was quite suitable for today. This object fell down. It was a meteorite, and in the newspaper it's no one understands this mysterious script that hasn't been deciphered yet. What does it mean? Nobody knows. And the point is, this is actually a joke in the newspaper. But it's like, obviously, they were joking about this because it was such a common topic. Objects from aliens crashing on Earth. Can you see what this means? Can you decipher the secret alien code? It actually says, is it hot enough for you? Because it fell in the middle of August. So it was a really hot day. So it was a joke, but it's a joke. But it means something. It means that people really believed in this kind of thing. And there were lots of other stories. In Cleveland, an object came down with hieroglyphs on it again. Okay, that's 1888. Well, this is a weird one. In the winter of 1888, a thundering meteor fell in a place that I have to read. It's actually in the Ukraine. I can actually pronounce that one. I thought it was a different Russian word. And they didn't know what it was, but they realized it was made of gold and other things. They started cutting it open. But they got to this little chamber And they said, what could be in the chamber? And what was it? It was a toad. There was a toad, a dried toad. And they said, why is there a dried toad in this meteorite? So they took it out and they put it in a bucket of water. 3 hours later, started swimming around. You can believe what you want. I don't care. But that's the idea. They should have talked to these people too. In Texas, 1891, the same thing again. Meteorite lands. Let's see what's inside it. They open it up. They find a dried fish. But not just a dried fish. There's a hook in its mouth. Okay? Another silly story. Yeah, but what are they really saying with this silly story? They're saying, well, because of course, it's the aliens who have made the hook. It becomes so obvious when you see so many of these silly stories that people really did believe all these things, and they were fascinated. They were selling newspapers because of this. In fact, this happened in Texas in 1891. In the year 1900, it happened again. Different meteorite, different fish, I suppose. Then we find pretty surreal things. An object crash-landed in the year 1891 again in Texas. And what do they find? Well, there were scraps of paper. Nobody knew what it was about. Scraps of paper with alien hieroglyphics written on them. If you know about UFOs, you've probably heard of alien hieroglyphics and alien writing. It's not such an uncommon subject. They were talking about this before your grandmothers were born. It just happened to fall in the exact place, a place called Wasson and Miller's Flour Mill in Erath County in Texas, where they went on to invent Dr. Pepper. That very same year. And so there's a local rumor, which is maybe Dr. Pepper got his secret ingredients from a crashed meteorite. I mean, they're just silly stories, but it's what they mean. That's the important thing. This is a really curious one. In November 1899, last story of the century, some hunters were out and they saw this meteor come down, bang, what is it? It was making these strange noises. They approached it and it looked like a mummy, a stone mummy. They said it looked like an Egyptian mummy. It looked like it had come out of a giant sarcophagus from the sky. They didn't know what it was, but if you blew into its open mouth, you could hear these weird groaning sounds. I mean, it sounds like a ghost story. There was a time in the past, the 19th century, in which ghost stories and UFO stories were mixing together. There was a fusion of the different styles. There's also a fusion of fairy stories and UFO stories, but not in the 1960s, in the 1860s, 1880s. Okay, the last one in this list I wanted to mention to you is this one here. It's much more recent. It's from 1926. Yeah, 1926. A farmer said that he'd found a skull, a human skull that had come out of a meteorite or something, because he'd seen a falling star, and he thought, my God, what's that? Maybe it's a spaceship. I mean, to have that thought means that you're already living in a culture in which that's possible to you. And so he looked around and he finally found what he believed had fallen from the sky, and it was a stone that looked like a skull. And for the next 2 weeks, he was tramping around the forests looking for the rest of the body, thinking he was going to find the rest of the body of the Martian, the alien, who'd crash-landed near his house. And he got all of the neighbors involved too. Everyone was out looking for the rest of the alien. So 20 years, this is 1926, 21 years before Roswell, people were talking about crashing aliens, crashing spaceships. We found a skull. You've heard about alien skulls and so on. Well, they were talking about that 20 years before Kenneth Arnold landed. Amazing stuff. Okay, so all of this basically has been totally forgotten, which is why I wanted to bring it to your attention today, because that's part of my job, to bring people to people's attention that there is a past. There is a past. We're just recycling old news. It doesn't mean that UFOs don't exist. It does mean be careful with what you read. I wanted to end with just a few cases that are under consideration, because you've probably got the conclusion, you've reached a conclusion by now that I don't believe anything I'm saying, that all of this is just nonsense, and that I don't believe anything apart from the only UFO that I saw myself. That wouldn't be true. But there are some very interesting historical cases that I'm working on now. I'd like you to know about them very quickly. Now, in 1857, there was a book published called The Magic Monitor. And it's a guidebook to health and happiness, marriage. It was made to give you instructions to treat your wife or husband really well, to cure your pains and maladies, and to help you stop masturbating. In my case, you'll have to imagine which of those worked for me. Now, what we find in this book is a story. And it doesn't fit into anything that I've mentioned so far. It's got nothing to do with meteorites, got nothing to do with anything. And it makes you think, makes me think. I don't know where it's from. So here, it's all about a little town called Jay in Ohio, where the neighbors saw a ship pass overhead. And they said that it was piloted, they could see it from some angle, it was piloted from 8-foot-tall people. It was obviously an extraterrestrial spaceship. We're talking about 1857 for people to reach that conclusion. The writer, the author of this book, mentions it among all his potions and medicine and advice for the future. I don't know why he even mentions it, but he did. He was probably interested in it too. I've got a quote from it here. Mr. Henry Wallace and other persons of Jay, Ohio have recently detailed to me the annexed. There are thousands of such cases on record. These gentlemen state that sometime since, on a clear and bright day, a shadow was thrown over the place where they were. This necessarily attracted their attention to the heavens, where they, one and all, beheld a large and curiously constructed vessel not over 100 yards from the earth. They could plainly discern a large number of people on board of her, whose average height appeared to be about 12 feet. The vessel was evidently worked by wheels and other mechanical appendages, all of which worked with a precision and a degree of beauty never yet attained by any mechanical skill upon this planet. They even had a picture, but this isn't a picture based on what they saw, because when they made books at the time, they just had an artist to come up with a picture. So the artist imagined a sailing ship with a weird circular attachment on it, and you can see people on the ground looking up. But the point is, this is a UFO case that doesn't fit. It doesn't fit into anything that I've described so far. And I went there with Kay Massingill, who's one of the biggest contributors to my Magana project. And she's a nurse from Mississippi. And we had a great time. We went to the village. It took me about 2 years to find it. It doesn't exist anymore. We went there, and there was nothing to see. There's just cornfields. You know, you find the occasional brick, and you think, well, maybe this is where the first UFO was ever seen, or at least it's where people believed that happened. And I just did that stupidly, symbolically at the end, because it took me 2 years to get there, but there was absolutely nothing to see there. And the man who wrote that book ends with this quote. He says, "I believe the time will come when all the inhabitants of all worlds or planets in the solar system will regularly visit each other, when in the fullness of fruition of things, an exchange of ideas and commodities, visiting and greetings between the respective inhabitants of all worlds or planets will be common and universal." That's not a novel. That's the man himself who wrote the book talking about it. There's this other story that I found. We don't have to read it all, but it's from 1874. And basically, it's two people walking, also in Ohio. They see this strange black object with fire coming out of it, pass through the sky, and instead of crashing, it lands. It actually lands slowly. The lights go out. What happens next? A door in the object opens up. A man comes out, dressed in black, with a little torch or lantern or something, some kind of light in his hand. And what does he do? He gets into a buggy, which is like a car without wheels, because there were no cars, and there was no horse. There's nothing. He gets into here, and he drives away. He drives away before the invention of cars. He comes down, he lands, he gets out, drives away, leaving the two witnesses looking at him. What does that mean? Is it true? Is it not? I don't know. It doesn't fit into any of the other stories that I've found. So I'm finding interesting things, though. I went there too, of course. There I am, approximately there, and you can see the kind of landscape that we saw. Then there is one more which I'd like to mention, and this is it now. Just want to finish on this story. I'm going to read it to you. It's something that happened in 1831. Okay, and let's imagine that it's a real UFO story. It could be. We don't know. It was published as news. And it reads like this. As James Smith, I'm going to have to move this a little bit. As James Smith, a labourer, was going to his work on Lansdowne on Thursday morning last, about 5:30 o'clock, it was completely dark, but all of a sudden it became as light as day. He looked up and he saw the element, that's the sky, in a quivering blaze of fire for the space of a minute. 1 minute, that's a long time. After which it became as dark as before. He never saw anything like it in his life. It appeared to him like flames issuing from the sky. The meteoric phenomenon was seen between Frome and Maiden Bradley by Mr. Wadman, Weymouth carrier, by the turnpike man at Midford, to whom it... sorry, I can take it out, can't I? Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's much better. Yes, it was seen by this man at Midford, Elliot, to whom it appeared in shape like the face of a clock. So we're talking about something circular, and about the height of a man. A quarter of a mile farther, it was seen by two men, and it appeared to them to have legs to it, like a man's legs. So beginning to think of a circular thing with legs. Who knows? The wife of the turnpike man said, as she lay in bed, the whole room appeared to her to be in a blaze. At Brislington, it passed by a wagoner with a rustling noise, like the wheel of a carriage, and there is a path where the grass is completely scorched by it. 1831, this is. It was seen at Devizes, very high in the element. It appeared in various shapes and threw out a great light. Farmer Woolley of Hinton saw it like a large tea kettle. It came down onto the earth and then rose up into the heavens again. Several men at the Fox Inn, Milford, saw it like a huge figure of fire in shape like a man. It passed by them and they thought they should have been burned to death by the heat, but of course they weren't. It then went up through the valley like a man running and passed two men near the canal, but it did not burn them, and then it ascended out of sight. And it ends like this. This phenomenon has been witnessed in various parts, in Devizes, in Wincanton, in Bridgewater, at the New Passage, by the Severn, at Frome and various other places. The country people seem puzzled about how to account for the dazzling light, the heat, the curious forms it assumed, and the numerous places in which it was seen. The millenarians will think the fulfillment of prophecy is at hand, or will think some wonderful events are coming until the philosophers convince them of its physical cause. And of course, no explanation ever came. So maybe you can help these poor people in England and tell them what you think happened that day, because I have no idea, but it sounds very much like a UFO to me. And we can finish for today. So, thank you very much.